We were a group of 12 writers gathered from across the country by the Collegeville Institute for a week of work, each on our own pages, and for evenings spent in community with one another. And as it is in many writing residencies, a good number of us were introverts, grateful for each other's company in small amounts of time, but equally grateful for the solitude of our workdays. So perhaps you can imagine the shudder of alarm that ran through our small group when told at dinner one night that our planned activity that evening would be led by an actor from the Twin Cities who would guide us in 2 hours of improv exercises. The very idea of being called into the center stage of even our small circle to perform in the moment without a script might have sent some of us running if we'd had a choice. But we didn't. In accepting our residency, we had agreed to be in community with one another, and on that night, we were told this was what community looked like, and this is what it required. So that is how I came to learn, reluctantly but gratefully, a number of years ago about the improv exercise of yes and. Perhaps some of you know this. After a good many warm-up games that were simple and silly enough for a 5-year-old's birthday party, our teacher, Greta Grosch, told us about the concept of yes and. The making of any improv work, she said, was all about the gift, both giving and receiving it. She explained that with 2 people on a stage, you're given the gift of some scenario. For instance, person A, whom we'll call June in this case, is on her hands and knees looking at the ground, and enter person B, whom we'll call Ted. June begins by enacting this given scenario, and Ted enters and responds to it. In its most basic form, Ted might say, "I see you are," and then he fills in the blank, offering June the gift of his interpretation. She then replies, saying, "Yes, and," receiving the gift of his words and adding to them with a gift of her own that moves the story forward. Then he replies, "Yes, and," accepting her gift and giving back another. And so it continues in this gift exchange that at its best is often funny, entertaining, creative, and sometimes even insightful. 2 of our group members then tried it out with this very scenario of searching for something on the ground. "I see you are looking for something," Ted said, entering the scene, to which June replied, "Yes, it's my contact lens." And Ted, following our instructions, got down on his hands and knees and said, "Yes, and I've lost my car keys too. I'll join you. We can look together." Now, we onlookers thought this was going just fine, but our teacher pointed out that Ted had never really fully accepted the gift that June had given him. Although he said yes and even got down on his knees with her, he redirected the story away from her contact lens and toward the search for his own car keys. It was more of a yes, but response, our teacher said, which is apparently much more common in real life than yes, and. This might seem like a minor difference, but I was astonished to consider the true impact that a yes and could have. Here was a practice telling us not just to acknowledge the gift of our partner's story with a nod or a yes, and to add to it with our own story. We were asked to enter our partner's story with them, to find and claim a role for ourselves in the scene they were creating, and to then play that role out authentically with the full investment of creativity that we might bring to a story of our own. And meanwhile, they were told to do the same with us. So what we were doing, both of us, was genuinely co-authoring a story on the spot, one plot twist at a time, in such a way that by the story's end, neither of us would be able to say definitively where one of our authorship left off and the others began. It was not unlike the making of a pot of stone soup, with the ingredients all coming from different people, mixing together to create something entirely new. You know, in my own writing, I could relate this to my co-authorship with my muse, who sometimes, at least when things are going well, insists that we share the creative steering wheel for a while. As we take turns steering, we drive together toward a destination that neither one of us has visited before. But what struck me most profoundly in that night of improv was not about writing at all, but about how my life might be different if I practiced yes and. In my everyday exchanges with other people, what would it look like to genuinely co-author with others the stories that we often claim to be writing and living together, while in truth, we are often competing for the byline? For instance, any marriage could be said to be a story, hopefully a long one with a happy ending, but we know that even the ones that qualify as that are sometimes filled with conflict, tension, and many an unforeseen plot twist. So what would it mean, I ask myself, in my own marriage, if I fully received my husband's words as the gift they might be, and built on them rather than arguing or passively steering the conversation in my own desired direction? Here's a conversation that my husband David and I have often, especially in the last year when several health challenges that I have had have required that I learn to live at a slower pace, respecting my limitations. David says, "Look at the calendar this month. It feels so full to me, there is no breathing room in it." To which I might respond, "Oh, but these are all wonderful things that we've been wanting to do. Isn't this great?" What if instead I said, "Yes," and what a bad feeling that is, to have it so full like this. Where do you suppose we might open a window for some air or make some room in it? The truth of the matter is that if I fully accept the gift of his comment, I will at least momentarily experience what he describes as the suffocation that can come from being overcommitted. And I confess that this is something that I typically am very quick to defend myself from. I convince myself that I can be happy and healthy living at a hectic, busy pace, even though my life has often proven otherwise. But if I pause instead and let myself feel, even for a moment, the suffocation that David describes, I recognize it is true for me too sometimes. And if I accept the gift of his observation by saying yes without dismissing it or defending myself from it, not only will it change the conversation we have, it has the potential to change me too. Each of us is made of stories. That's how our identities are not only formed, but often fiercely defended. Ben Okri, the Nigerian poet, playwright, and novelist, once called our species Homo fabula. He said, "We are all storytelling beings." Think about it. We not only tell stories to one another, but first and foremost, we tell stories to ourselves about who we are and about the world and others in it. This is one of the beautiful gifts of being human, isn't it? But what is also true is that as storytelling beings, we often have a hard time opening our story up to others, even when we think we want to. Like some of you, no doubt, in the past year, I have often been wearing a button that says Black Lives Matter. Last November, when Black Lives Matter in Minneapolis was occupying the street outside a police precinct station in protest of the killing of Jamar Clark, I was spending some time there supporting the occupation and participating in protests, and at the height of the occupation, one day I returned from the precinct to my hometown just across the border in Wisconsin, and I stopped at Chipotle for dinner. As I stood at the checkout, the African-American teen waiting on me smiled warmly and said a bit shyly, "I like your button." So full of the day's experiences I responded without thinking, saying, full of enthusiasm, "Yes, I was just at the 4th Precinct, and it's so amazing what is happening there." To which the teen gave me a curious look of mild confusion, as if wholly unaware of what I was talking about, which brought me back to the here and now of standing in a Chipotle in Hudson, Wisconsin, where quite possibly there were many teens, some of them Black, who were not following the developments in the 4th Precinct of Minneapolis, at least enough to recognize it by that name. And I realized then, as we exchanged warm smiles instead of more words, and looked into each other's eyes, that his comment about my button was very likely a personal response, a gift of connection that I had not fully received because I was so full of my own story about the precinct. On later reflection, I considered what might have been a better yes and reply, opening the story to a larger set of possibilities and connection instead of narrowing it down so quickly to my own agenda and my own story. Thankfully, soon after, in a grocery store, wearing the same button, I had the chance to try it out. "I like your button," said the African-American teen bagging my groceries. To which I replied, "Yes, and won't it be a good day when we don't need a button to say it's so?" Truthfully, one of the biggest challenges in learning the wisdom of yes and is simply learning to listen, not just with open ears, but also with eyes and hearts open too, to pay attention to others and what they're saying with and without words, in a way that lets them change the direction of the story we have been trying so hard to control, which is the same thing as letting them change us. And this, I would suggest, is at the heart of the power of blessing. Ursula Le Guin, the author of so many wildly creative science fiction stories, once wrote an amusing essay about being changed by others. With tongue in cheek, she titled it, "Being Taken for Granite." Not granted, mind you, but granite. She writes this, "Sometimes I am taken for granite. And this troubles and distresses me because I am not granite and should not be taken for it. I am not flint or diamond or any of that great hard stuff. I wish that those who take me for granite would once in a while treat me like mud. Being mud is really different than being granite and should be treated differently. Mud lies around being wet and heavy and oozy and generative. Mud is underfoot. People make footprints in mud. As mud, I accept feet. I accept weight. I try to be supportive. I like to be obliging. Granite does not accept footprints," she continues. "It refuses them. Huge, heavy things come and stand on granite, and granite just stays there and doesn't react and doesn't give way and doesn't adapt and doesn't oblige. And when the huge, heavy things walk away, the granite is there just the same as before, just exactly the same, admirably so. To change granite, you have to blow it up. But when people walk on me, you can see exactly where they put their feet. And when huge, heavy things come and stand on me, I yield and react and respond and give way and adapt and accept. No explosives are called for. No admiration is called for either. I am just mud. And so when people and huge, heavy things walk away, they are not changed, except their feet are muddy. But I am changed. I am still here and still mud, but all full of footprints and deep, deep holes and tracks and traces and changes. I have been changed. You change me. Do not take me for granted." Friends, how often in this land of granite bedrock of individualism do we take one another for granted. Not only assuming we are not leaving footprints on others, but defending, or one might say hardening, our hearts so that no one else will dare leave footprints on us. And how often, for that matter, do we take the earth for granted, not acknowledging the deep footprints we are leaving all around the globe with our lives of consumption and environmental destruction? Sticking to the human part of this, though, one doesn't have to look far past the front pages of our newspapers and the stages of our candidate debates to see that we are much more inclined to meet one another, rock to rock like flint, making dangerous sparks and explosions rather than joining together to write our way through the messy, muddy, generative story of our times. Our faith tradition as Unitarian Universalists is based on this messy, muddy, generative way of being. We are called to have faith in our connection to one another, to find a role and entry point into another person's story and to take it up with them in such a way as to move the story forward, together, toward unexpected and quite possibly justice-seeking and healing outcomes that promise to change us all. I'm not just talking about the power of agreeing with others who are like-minded, but also, and more importantly, the challenging, compassionate choice to enter the stories of those with whom we do not agree and engaging with them in a wild exercise of imagination and connection and blessing, together creating a story with room for new possibilities as yet unknown. We believe in the power of community and its invitation to write such a story of faith across differences in new ways that may at times surprise us all. Remember the story of Francis David. David, the 16th century Transylvanian who more than 400 years ago proclaimed the unity of God and defended the need for religious tolerance of differences. He was one of Unitarianism's earliest martyrs. Convicted in 1579 of the crime of religious innovation, he was sentenced to life in prison. When he died several months later, these words were found inscribed on the wall of his dungeon cell. Neither the sword of popes, nor the cross, nor the image of death, nothing will halt the march of truth. I wrote what I felt, and that is what I preached in trusting spirit. I am convinced that after my destruction, the teachings of false prophets will collapse. Sadly, not only teachings have collapsed, but many, many human lives long ago and still today have been lost to the forces that say no. No to new thinking, to free faith, and to sharing the authorship of our still unfolding human story. We in this room must remember that we are part of a faith tradition that began with the word "and," a right of conscience for which many paid with their lives. When we say yes to this free faith tradition, we are agreeing to continue that story, not only to be part of a community that makes room for our beliefs, for our needs, for our wishes, but more significantly, to be changed by participating in a community that makes room for others within and beyond our faith community. We are agreeing, in short, to be changed by one another as we participate in the human story that we are all still writing together. One of my favorite descriptions of blessing comes from the writer John O'Donohue, who wrote that a blessing, quote, awakens future wholeness, which is to say that a blessing touches us where we are in the unique, sometimes beautiful, and often broken truth of our individual stories. And it inclines us, it opens us, awakens us to our place in the family of life and of all beings. It invites us to participate in a larger story, one woven of love and wholeness, of right relationship and promise, of justice and of peace. Surely this is an act of blessing, a sacred act of improvisation and creativity with the power to change us and to change the world. The stage we live on, friends, is made of great change. So much is collapsing. What is the truth? What is the power that remains in the story that is our times? Surely the gift of connection and blessing is still here if we'll take it. If we say yes to one another and to the world we share and continue with the word and, writing our way into a new story that none of us can imagine or write alone. But together, that is another possibility waiting.